Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Classical Music Cadences. This time, we'll talk about the half cadence, including types, norms, and exceptional cases. Just like authentic cadences, the half cadence is another type of closing formula, but one that implies an open ending or unresolved harmonic tension, which is why this kind of cadence is sometimes compared to suspension points or even to a question mark in the speech. In musical terms, a half cadence is an ending on the fifth scale degree of a given key, which is its dominant. As a general rule, this last chord must be a perfect major triad, without dominant seventh or any other kind of dissonance attached to it. Notice that the dominant chord of any given key in classical tonal music will always be a major triad, no matter if said reference key is major or minor. This dominant chord must also be displayed in root position, which means its root note should be in the bass. Possible exceptions to these general rules will be addressed in the last part of this video. There are essentially two main types of half cadence. The simplest one displays a first to fifth scale degree progression, which is tonic to dominant, while the second type displays a subdominant to dominant progression, which means either fourth or second scale degree to fifth scale degree. Both types will be discussed in depth, including all their variants, in the following sections of this video. In formal terms, a half cadence can be used to end single thematic units, especially when the composer looks for a less conclusive feeling compared to the perfect authentic cadence. But it's also commonly used as a middle articulation within certain thematic units called periods, in which the first half ends with a half cadence or imperfect authentic cadence, and the second one, which is a literal or varied repetition, ends with a perfect authentic cadence. Another common use of the half cadence is at the end of the transition section in the classical sonata form. These usually are the more emphatic and elaborated kind of half cadences. Tonic to dominant half cadence. In the tonic to dominant half cadence, the normative bass motion goes from the first to the fifth scale degree, which is an inversion of the bass clausula of the perfect authentic cadence. This means the bass leaps a perfect fourth down, or a perfect fifth up. With regard to upper voices resolution, half cadences in general are a lot more flexible than authentic cadences. The presence of the root note in the last chord's top voice is not mandatory, and we can find plenty of examples where the dominant chord displays its third or fifth instead, which allows for different melodic possibilities. Eventually, we can find examples of unison resolutions, where all or most of the voices perform the bass motion at the same time. Just like the analog cases for authentic cadences, these are to be considered exceptional cases that are only used in very specific musical passages, normally related to big orchestral tuttes. We can also find examples of what I call delayed resolutions, in which the bass resolves right away, but the upper voices are delayed during at least one beat. Subdominant to dominant half cadence. The subdominant to dominant half cadence is even more common than the tonic to dominant one. Its harmonic progression resembles an authentic cadential progression that lacks its final tonic chord. However, in practical terms, this type of half cadence serves the same purposes as the tonic to dominant one and can be used in the same contexts. The bass motion displayed in this example is, by far, the most common one, and it's known by some authors as the gallant half cadence, because of its likeness to the perfect authentic gallant cadence, which we already talked about in the first video of this series. When the second scale degree is used instead, it usually appears in first inversion, with its third in the bass, which allows to retain the gallant half cadence bass pattern. In the minor mode, the triad built on the fourth scale degree is by default a minor one. And the second scale degree, a diminished triad. As I already explained in the first video of this series, the root note of this diminished triad could be lowered a half tone, turning it into a major triad, which is the so-called Neapolitan sixth. Notice that, when the Neapolitan sixth resolves into a dominant chord, this leads to an irregular resolution of the inner voices, called false or cross relation, which is what happens when the chromatic resolution of a single melodic line is divided between different voices. According to normative voice-leading rules, this is considered a fault, but in the case of the Neapolitan sixth half cadence, cross relations are exceptionally accepted. In actual music contexts, it's extremely common that subdominant to dominant half cadences appear in the form of what I call delayed resolution, which some authors may call the compound gallant half cadence. In this type of resolution, the bass proceeds as usual, but the upper voices move as passing tones, resolving to the dominant triad at least one beat after the bass. In the music of Beethoven, which represents a late stage of the classical music period, some of these conventions are still present, but treated with a lot more of freedom. In this example, the compound gallant half cadence at bar 8 is implicit, for it only displays the top line resolution, omitting the rest of the voices until the full dominant triad appears. Descending bass and Phrygian half cadences. Occasionally, half cadences based on a descending bass pattern are found, in which the bass line descends by stepwise motion through the first, seventh, sixth, and fifth scale degrees. While this particular cadence could be theoretically harmonized as follows, in practice it mostly appears as unison, as we shall see in the next examples. The harmonization of this bass line leads to what some theorists know as the Printer schema, which is why this type of half cadence might as well be called the Printer half cadence. The Printer schema is, somewhat, tonally ambiguous, as depending on the musical context the arrival note can be heard either as dominant or as tonic. This makes it a very useful tool when it comes to modulation. In the minor mode, the equivalent bass pattern is the Phrygian tetrachord. The harmonization of this tetrachord leads to what is commonly known as the Andalusian or Phrygian cadence. The Phrygian cadence is also tonally and modally ambiguous, as its ending note can be heard either as a fifth scale degree, or as the first scale degree of the dominance Phrygian mode. However, in the context of the 18th century classical music period, only the first possibility was usually taken into account, as the church modes were mostly considered out of fashion at that point. The use of the Phrygian cadence was restricted to the minor mode, and it was normally reserved for archaizing passages, which were common in church music. In this excerpt, Mozart executes a Phrygian cadence, but with an extended formula that includes an extra harmony in between, while keeping the normative bass line. Notice the characteristic expressive implications of this kind of cadence. Augmented sixth and converging half cadences. Half cadence progressions can be extended by including secondary dominants before the final dominant chord. One of the most common procedures is the addition of an augmented sixth chord. In this type of chord, the bass and the augmented sixth must resolve by contrary motion into a perfect eighth interval in the next chord, each one of them moving to the dominant's root note. There are three main types of augmented sixth chords, which are the Italian, the more dissonant French, and the German augmented sixth. Keep in mind that these names are mere conventions, and that they don't refer to specific musical practices based on the composer's origin. On the contrary, back in the 18th century these formulas were well known by every composer across the different Western regions. You may have noticed that when the German augmented sixth resolves directly to the dominant chord, it leads to consecutive parallel fifths, which is a forbidden motion according to voice-leading general rules. This specific case of parallel fifths is sometimes referred to as Mozartian fifths, and many theorists consider it as an acceptable exception to the rule. However, as we shall see later, the very name is misleading, as Mozart himself actually used to avoid these parallel fifths by different procedures whenever possible. In actual music passages, the augmented sixth is normally preceded by a subdominant chord, usually the fourth scale degree in first inversion. In the major mode, this leads to a very distinctive bass line motion. Let's have a closer look. In this case, we can see how the fifth of the German augmented sixth chord doesn't resolve normatively to the dominant's fifth. Instead, it leaps down to its third, letting the other voices reach the fifth by legal motion, and avoiding the parallel Mozartian fifths altogether. In the end, everything happens so quickly that the trick is likely to go unnoticed. In this other example, the fifth of the German augmented sixth only appears briefly as part of an arpeggio, so it doesn't even need to be resolved at all, while the fifth of the dominant chord is reached from another voice instead. Then again, no Mozartian fifths in a Mozart's passage. The other common type of secondary dominant used in half cadences is the so-called converging cadence. In this type of cadence the bass line ascends chromatically from the fourth to the fifth scale degree, while the top voice descends by stepwise motion. The middle chord in a converging cadence can be harmonized according to the different possible secondary dominant chords, as long as the characteristic bass line motion is kept in the lower voice. In this example I used a diminished seventh chord built on the dominant seventh scale degree, which is one of the most common options in both major and minor mode. Notice that this cadence works just as well when the first chord is the second scale degree in first inversion. With regard to the final chord's top voice, while the third of the dominant chord is the most common option, it could be also the fifth or even the root note, as long as they're reached by descending stepwise motion. Exceptional cases. At the beginning of this video we stated that in a half cadence, the ending dominant chord must be a major triad without seventh. But that's not entirely true. Even if that definition matches the common perception among most theorists, composers in the 18th century also considered an alternative type of half cadence, which we may call the dissonant dominant one. In this type of half cadence, the ending dominant harmony must include a dissonance, which may be the dominant seventh when the dominant chord is built on the fifth scale degree, or even be built on the seventh scale degree instead, which is a diminished triad, also optionally including its diminished or half diminished seventh. There is, however, specific context for this type of half cadence, which is only used before an implicit or explicit fermata, a momentary stop in the musical flow that usually feels like if the music was catching its breath before resuming its way. There is yet another type of controversial half cadence, one that was not acknowledged by 18th century theorists, and which many modern theorists don't even consider a half cadence at all, with regard to 18th century classical music repertoire. That's the non-dominant half cadence. An alleged half cadence in which the tonal goal is not a dominant function chord, but any other, except from the tonic, which are usually preceded by their own secondary dominants. Beyond their name, these types of unofficial half cadences are closely related to the dissonant dominant half cadence, in the sense that they also act as a musical break that increases the expectation forward. Whether or not we decide to include them in the half cadence family, they represent a valuable musical resource that is worth knowing. That's everything for now. Let me know if this video was helpful, and see you next time.